All right, hey everyone, welcome to Excel for Analysts, Mastering Advanced Formulas and Functions.
Just want to give a quick intro about the course structure, the teaching style, and the references and resource docs that are going to be available to you throughout the course. So let's jump right in. Talking about course structure, most of the instruction will take place through screencasts. So I'll be walking you through different formulas, really cool demos and project examples. But rather than just showing you my screen, I'm going to provide the same files available to you for download so that you can follow step by step and learn by getting your hands dirty and actually working with the real data. At the same time, I'm going to go through some PowerPoint slides to really cover the key concepts and formulas. I will also provide those for download throughout the course. So at the beginning of each section, you'll see a PDF file that you can download, as well as any Excel files that I'll be using for demonstrations. So really useful for you guys if you want to download them, print them, make yourself a little booklet. Can be really, really helpful, especially as we start getting into the more complicated stuff. Formula syntax can get a little wild, so it can be really helpful to just have something in your hand that you can refer to as we go forward. Topics covered, we're going to cover a lot of stuff. This is a very thorough, very comprehensive course. We're going to kick things off with a Formulas 101 section, where we'll talk about basic formula syntax, formula library and auditing tools, different reference types, common error messages, how to deal with them, and then a bunch of different shortcuts with the F keys, Control, Alt keys, etc. Then we'll dive into the formulas, so we'll start with logical operators. These are all based on common if, and or statements. We'll go into statistical functions, cover all the basic ones, max, min, small, large, and then talk about some really cool ones like rank, rand, and using SUMIFs and COUNTIFs to build really cool dynamic dashboards. We'll go into lookup and reference functions, which is one of my favorite sections. Talk VLOOKUP, each lookup, and then go through some pretty awesome demos with index match and offset, some stuff you've probably never seen before. After that, we'll go into text formulas. So these are basically any formulas that you would use to manipulate text in Excel. Upper or lower, proper or left, mid, right, search, trend, etc. Date and time functions, definitely another one of my favorites. We'll go through basically how Excel thinks about dates using the date value. We'll talk today, now, date diff, year frac, end of month, all that good stuff. We'll do a quick section on formula-based formatting, where we'll really spend some time walking through different demos for how to create, edit, and manage formula-based formatting rules where you can do some really cool stuff. We'll talk about array functions or formulas, which are kind of a different beast in Excel if you've never used them. They operate a little bit differently, so I want to spend some time talking about those. We'll do vertical, horizontal arrays, two-dimensional arrays, and then walk through a bunch of samples like transpose. Last but not least, go into bonus, badass tips. These are just really cool functions that don't necessarily fit into one of those buckets. We've got hyperlink where you can bounce around between tabs. Indirect, which is a really interesting function that we'll get to later. And then web service and filter XML, which are pretty amazing tools there. You tap into real-time data sources like APIs or data available through a website. Feed it directly into Excel, so things like real-time weather conditions, stock quotes, stuff like that. So obviously a lot to cover here. Hope you're excited to learn. I know I'm excited to dive in. So let's do this. All right, welcome to Section 2, Formulas 101. This section is really just about laying the groundwork for what's to come. So let's start with a deep dive into the formula library and the auditing tools, which can be really helpful if you've got broken formulas. I'll talk basic formula syntax, go into fixed and relative references, which is a really important section. I'll talk about common error messages, why you might be getting them, how to get around them. Also share a tip called if error, which basically lets you customize those error messages. Going to talk useful shortcuts, so function and control shortcuts, plus alt key tips. We'll go into data validation, really nice tool to help make your work more dynamic in Excel. And then last but not least, volatile versus fixed functions. In this section, you'll see 2 files available for download. Got the Excel for Analysts Formulas 101 PDF file, plus the Section 2 Fixed Relative References Excel file. So go ahead and give those a download, and then let's dive right in. All right, so let's take a minute to talk about the Formulas tab, and specifically the formula library and the auditing tools. So this here is basically a lay of the land. You've got your formula library here on the left with drop-down options, and you've got your auditing tools over to the right. I'm actually going to jump into a new Excel sheet just to show you how these work. So as you can see, I'm in the Formulas tab. I can drill down into any one of these categories, scroll through to get a sense of what each of these functions does. So for instance, the lookup looks up a value either from a 1-row or 1-column range or from an array, etc. So it's kind of an interesting way to see all of the formulas that Excel has to offer. There's some crazy stuff in here. To be honest, I have no idea what ceiling math is. We won't be covering that in this course, but if you're interested, it's here for you to dig into. So when you're writing a formula, there are a couple ways to do it. The first way, which actually would not recommend, is to go into the library, pick your formula. In this case, I've just picked match kind of arbitrarily. And what that does is it populates the formula in the formula bar, and it opens up this wizard to kind of guide you through each piece of the function. Yeah, that's great, but I feel like it's kind of the lazy man's approach to writing Excel formulas. And as soon as you want to do anything more complicated, like nest formulas together or customize your formulas, this kind of breaks down because it holds your hand a little bit too much. So I'd actually recommend not doing that. I'd recommend clicking in the formula bar, starting with an equal sign, and writing it out the old-fashioned way. And as you can see, Excel still helps you along. This little box pops up. This is actually really useful. It guides you through each step to help you with the syntax. So if I'm writing a match function, I know that I need to start with the lookup value. I'll just pick a random cell. And then as I comma over, you see the bold text changes. So now I need a lookup array, and then I'm going to need a match type, and so on and so forth. So don't worry about match specifically. We'll cover that in the lookup reference section, but just so you know that tool is there to help you along. The next thing to talk about is the auditing tool section, which is over here. It does some really cool things. It allows you to trace precedence, which basically shows which cells affect the outcome of your formula. And then kind of the opposite of that, it shows which cells your formula affects. You can show all your formulas in the workbook as text, as opposed to the output or result of your formulas. And then the Evaluate Formula tool is a nice way to diagnose a formula when you have an error and you're not sure why you're getting that error. So to demonstrate that, I'm just going to do a really quick example. I'm just going to pop in some values in row 1, we do 5, 7, 8. And then in cell A2, I'm just going to do a simple formula, A1 times B1 times C1, which equals 280. That's great, but what if my finger slips and instead of an 8, I write the letter P? Now all of a sudden I'm getting an error value, and it's pretty obvious what happened in this case, but let's say, those input cells were on different sheets, or they were hidden, and it wasn't quite so clear where that error was coming from. So what I can do is select A2 where my formula lives, click Evaluate Formula. What this does is it walks through each step of the formula and evaluates piece by piece so that you can see where your formula breaks down. So first piece is underlined, it's A1. Click Evaluate, and it'll change to 5. So that's saying A1 equals 5. B1 equals 7. 5 times 7 equals 35. C1 equals P. And 35 times P equals #value. So this tool just showed me that the error in my formula is coming from the value in C1, which is P. And as you probably know, you can't multiply a number by a letter. So I can take a look and say, oh yeah, I accidentally hit P. Let's just change that back to 8. And then all is right with the world again. So there you go. You got your formula library here, your auditing tools here, both within the Formulas tab in Excel. I just want to take 1 minute to walk through the Evaluate Formula tool one more time with a much more complicated example. So a lot of people assume they'll never need to use the Evaluate Formula tool, or they think that because Excel already does a pretty good job helping you through formulas, that there's really no point. I'll be honest, I've had a number of times where my formulas will break, and without the Evaluate Formula tool, I may have never figured out why. So here's a good example to help illustrate that. In this case, we're looking at a really advanced, really complicated array function, which nests all sorts of functions, index, small, if, row, and rows, to basically return a subset of values from a range in columns A through D. And unlike the last example, which only had 3 simple elements to it, in this case, when I evaluate the formula, it's going to cycle through dozens of different steps as it walks through each piece of the function. And this will give me the ability to pinpoint exactly where things are breaking. Now, obviously, I'm not going to explain exactly how this is functioning just yet, but hopefully this is a good example of when the Evaluate Formula tool can be a lifesaver. So here it's finally gotten to the end. It evaluated properly and returned the value 1/4/2016. So don't count this out. Remember, especially as your work starts to get more complicated, that Evaluate Formula tool can be extremely helpful. Okay, so let's take a minute to talk about formula syntax, which is essentially how a formula is written or how it's built. And so all Excel formulas are going to start with the equal sign. You can either select them from the formula library. I wouldn't recommend that. I'd actually recommend typing them directly into the formula bar. And like I mentioned, once you've entered your function name, this box will pop up that will guide you through each component of the function step by step. Most formulas, not all, but most of them, contain some sort of reference to a cell, and those references can take 3 different forms. They can be single-cell references, they can be array references, and they can be non-contiguous references. So a single-cell reference just describes an individual cell's location within a worksheet in terms of the intersection between a column, noted with a letter, and a row, noted with a number. As of Excel 2013, columns go from A through XFD, which is just over 16,000 columns, and rows extend from 1 through 1,048,576. So a single-cell reference will just look like the combination of a letter and a number. Array references describe a contiguous group of cells, meaning that they share a border, and it's described based on the location of the top left cell and the bottom right cell. So if I selected the range from A1 through C4, the array reference would look like this. It would be the top left cell, which is A1, followed by a colon, and then the bottom right cell, which is C4. Last but not least, you have non-contiguous references. These describe selections of individual cells that don't share a common border. So A1 and C4 separately, for instance, and those are separated by a comma. So let's hop over to Excel. I'll do a really quick demo just with a blank worksheet to show you how this is working. So I'm just going to type 1 into cell A1, drag it down 10 rows, and then just do a fill series that it gives me the series from 1 to 10. And then in cell C2, I'm just going to show you a few different forms that cell references can take using a simple sum function. So if I start with the sum of just an individual cell, A3 for instance, as you can see, A3 is a single cell reference, and when I hit enter, obviously I'm just getting the value of A3. I can change that reference, so rather than A3, I can either delete and type a new reference in the formula bar, or I can just drag out my reference right here. So now I'm looking at the sum of a contiguous reference from A3 through A7. When I hit enter, I get 25 because 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7 equals 25. And then last but not least, if I wanted to add or sum A3 and A10, I can just basically delete that reference, select A3, hold Control, select A10. And as you can see, Excel has separated those two non-contiguous selections with a comma. When I press enter, I get 13. So there you go. Those are the 3 main forms of cell reference types. All right, fixed, relative, and mixed references. You may have noticed that some formulas have dollar signs included, some don't. Basically, that dollar sign is what's used to indicate the reference type. So what it's doing is it's basically locking a specific cell range or reference or part of a cell range or reference so that it won't change if you apply or drag or paste that formula to other cells. So there are 4 different types. You can have a completely fixed reference, which would have a dollar sign in front of the column indicator and the row. So $A, $1. You can also just fix the column or just fix the row, in which case you'd only have the dollar sign in front of one or the other. Or you can leave it completely relative, which is the default version in Excel, where there will be no dollar signs whatsoever. So it's a little tricky to wrap your head around, but let's try to visualize what's going on here. So if I have a formula in A1 or a formula that has a reference to A1, and then I paste that formula down to C4, if my reference was completely fixed, A1 would not change as I move that formula down and over. If I were only fixing the row, as I paste down, you can see that the column shifts from A to C, but the row remains 1. Also, if I just fix the column, the A stays the same, but the row changes from 1 to 4 as you move it down. And then, of course, if you have it completely relative, both the A and the 1 change. It becomes a C4. So, quick little pro tip here. As you're writing your formula, if you actually put the cursor in the middle of one of your references and hit F4, you can repeatedly hit that to scroll through each reference type. It's just a little bit quicker than typing in dollar signs every time. So always think about your references, especially as you're using multiple formulas. Let's jump into Excel. I want to show you kind of a hands-on demo of how this is really working. If you could open up the Section 2 Fixed Relative References file, I'm going to work from there. You'll see there's only one tab called Multiplication Table. And basically, I've set up a blank table with values from 1 to 10. And all I want to do is populate this multiplication table. So if I start and just say equals B1 times arrow over to A2 and hit enter, 1 times 1 equals 1. It's fantastic. Drag it over to column K. I'll drag it down to row 11. And obviously something's gone horribly wrong here. This isn't correct math at all. And to diagnose what might be going on, what we can do is select any cell, hit the F2 key, and that will show us which cells the formula references. And if I just do that on a few different cells, I can tell that it's always referring to the cell immediately above and immediately to the left of my formula, which isn't what we want. We always want to multiply by the horizontal row and by the vertical column in A. So I'm going to click within the B1 in my formula and just hit F4. As you can see, that adds basically a completely fixed reference. It fixes the column B and it fixes the row 1. If I do the same to A2 and hit enter, now what happens if I apply this all the way over? I get 1 every single time. And as you can see, it's always referring to B1 and A2 no matter where the formula lives. So one more step that I need to take is to think about which piece of each of these references do I want to change and which piece do I want to stay the same. So for my first piece, B1, what do I want to be able to change, the column B or the row 1? So obviously my multiplication values always live in row 1, so I don't want that to change. But as I drag the formula over, I do want it to update to multiply by the value in column C, D, E, and so on. So all I'm going to do is remove the dollar sign before the B, and then think about the same situation for my A2 reference. In this case, my multiplication values always live in column A, but I want to update that to multiply by the value in row 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So in this case, don't want my row to be fixed, but I do want my column to be fixed. So if I hit enter, now if I apply this out and down, there you go. You can see I have a proper multiplication table. All right, so let's just take a minute to talk about common Excel errors and the if error statement. It doesn't matter if you're the most talented Excel user on the planet, at one point or another, you're bound to come across some of these error messages. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not something we should be afraid of. In fact, sometimes errors can be really helpful things. So let's talk about 5 common error types, what they mean, and how we can go about trying to fix them. The first is just a series of hash marks or pound signs. What that typically means is that the column just isn't wide enough to display your values. That's the most common cause. In some cases, you might get this value. If Excel is having a hard time recognizing that particular date value, but more often than not, the easiest fix is just to drag or double-click your column border to increase your width, or right-click to set up a custom column width. So super easy fix there. The next error type is the name error, which means that Excel doesn't recognize text in a formula. So this could happen if you type your function name wrong, if you mistyped a reference, if you miss quotation marks or colons. So make sure that all of those things are correct. 9 out of 10 times that I get a name error, it's because I didn't surround a text string within a formula with the proper quotation marks, or I left out a parenthesis or a comma somewhere in my formula. The value error means that formula has the wrong type of argument. So just make sure that your formula is not trying to do something wacky like perform an arithmetic operation on text strings. Make sure you don't have values that may be accidentally formatted as text. If you try to multiply 8 by P, Excel is going to give you a value error. Next up, div 0. This one speaks for itself. You're trying to divide by 0 or by an empty cell. So just check the value of your divisor. And like I mentioned, 0 might be the correct number. So there's nothing wrong. So you can either keep the div 0 error there, or you can use an if statement, specifically if error, to display an alternate value if you choose to do so. So let me show you a quick example of how to do that in just a moment. Last but not least, we've got the ref error, which is that the formula is referring to a cell that's not valid. And how to fix this, just make sure that you didn't move, delete, or replace cells that are referenced in your formula. So for instance, if you have a lookup or a reference function that's reading from a specific column of cells, and then you accidentally delete that column, all of your functions that were referenced in that column are now going to give you a ref error because they don't know what values or cells to read from. So those are 5 common types of errors. Let's jump into the if error statement, which is a personal favorite function of mine. It's a really great tool to eliminate annoying error messages, your div zeros, your NAs, your refs, which can be really useful for front-end formatting. So that's kind of the most common application that I've found, is that if you're sharing something like a dashboard or a presentation with colleagues or clients and you want to just polish it, button it up, you can use the if error statement to customize those error messages to something a little less in your face as these Excel errors may be. The other thing I'll note is that if error can be a really great tool to eliminate errors among values, because sometimes those errors will prevent Excel from performing operations on those values. And you might want to replace an NA with a 0, for instance, so that your statistical and arithmetic calculations continue to work properly. We'll also explore that in one of the later sections, but just a heads up. Syntax-wise, the if error statement is quite simple. Just 2 components. It starts with your value. This could be either a value itself or, more likely, a formula which may or may not result in an error. And then after that, you comma over to the value if error piece, and this is just the value that you want to return in the case of an error, in place of the error message that it would have thrown. So 2 examples here. If we have a division problem, A1 divided by B1, and we know that the B1 might potentially be a 0 in some cases, we can say, all right, instead of giving me a div 0, when you do this function, instead return the text string invalid formula. In this other example, we're saying, if you get an error when you run this VLOOKUP function, just show me a dash in quotes, which is a lot cleaner. So pro tip, if you're running a formula that may trigger an error, like a lookup value or not all values might have a match, write the full formula first, and then at the end, wrap it in an if-error statement. Otherwise, things can get a little bit sketchy pretty quick, especially as we start working with some longer or more complicated nested functions. So now I just want to hop over to Excel, really quickly show you an example of how the if-error statement can be used in practice. I'm going to show you more examples specific to certain formulas in the upcoming sections. But just as a quick example, we're looking at a weekly performance dashboard. Here, I've got some volume metrics, spend, impressions, and clicks, and then a couple calculated fields. The ones that I want to focus on right now are click-through rate and cost per click, which are defined as clicks divided by impressions for click-through rate, and spend divided by clicks for cost per click. So since we have data for spend, impressions, and clicks, these formulas are populating just fine. But let's say for any given week, we could expect these numbers to actually drop down to 0. So I'll do this for just 2 weeks as an example. Now, as you can see, these formulas are now flagging div0 errors, and it's kind of annoying. I could remove the green flags in the Excel options, but really I just don't want to see this error at all. But what I want to do is essentially wrap these formulas with an if-error statement so that instead of div0, I want to just show a little dash. So what I'm going to do is jump to cell F6 and wrap this formula in an if-error. So right after the equal sign, I'm going to type if-error, open the parentheses, jump to the end, press comma, and then here's my value of error, which is just going to be a dash surrounded by quotes. Close off the parentheses, press enter, and again, we're going to practice this a bit more shortly, but I'm going to do the exact same thing for the CPC column. If error, jump to the end, comma, dash, and quotes, close the parentheses, hit enter. As you can see, nothing changed for cells F6 and G6 because the formula didn't return an error. But if I drag that down, and I'm just going to fill without formatting to preserve the formatting underlying, now you can see those div errors are replaced by nice, clean little dashes. So it just looks a lot nicer now, a lot more polished. So there you go, just one quick example of how to use if error. Okay, I want to share some of my favorite shortcuts. I'm going to walk through with 3 different types. We've got function or F key shortcuts. We're going to talk about control shortcuts and alt shortcuts, otherwise known as alt key tips. So starting with function shortcuts, there are 2 that I use more than any others. The first is F4, which I've talked about. One way that it's useful is by allowing you to add or modify cell reference types. So like I showed you, in one of the earlier lectures, you can place your cursor directly into the cell reference and use F4 to cycle through fixed relative and mixed reference types. You can also use F4 to repeat your last command or action. This is really useful for things like inserting or deleting rows or columns, changing cell formats or styles, etc. One thing that F4 does not do is it won't repeat entered values or formulas. So I'll show you some examples of that. And then the other F shortcut is the F2, which basically dives into a formula. It displays the cell ranges that are tied to a given formula, and it allows you to edit those ranges or edit the formula itself. Really useful to help diagnose formula errors or make quick adjustments to cell references and arrays on the fly. So I showed you a sneak preview of how the F2 key works when we built that multiplication table. But let's jump into Excel and take a look at one more example. So I've got a formula in column C, a very basic data array here. Again, if I click into any reference, F4 will cycle through each of the different reference types. I can also use it to repeat an action such as inserting a row. So now I'll select row 4 and just hit F4. Select 6, hit F4. As you can see, that's working nicely, and I can actually just undo that if I decide I don't want to make those changes. Now the F2 key, if I select any formula cell, hit F2, it's going to allow me to dive in and edit the formula. Now as you can see, it highlights the cells that are referenced. So one little trick is if I want to change the reference, so let's say I want it to be B2 divided by A3 instead of A2, instead of going in and typing A3, what I can do is actually just grab this reference, drag it down, and it will change it for me. So that's a nice little trick with the F2 function. Moving on to the control functions, there are three that I use all the time. There's control arrow, which jumps to the left, right, top, or bottom edge of a contiguous data array. So basically the last cell that contains data. Control shift arrow does the same thing, except it selects the data as you move. So most common application of the control shift arrow shortcut is when you want to select an entire array of data and you don't want to have to scroll all the way down. Sometimes you have an array that's 100 or 200,000 rows long, so you can just start in A1, hold control and shift. Arrow right, arrow down, and you've got your entire array of data. Last tip here is control page up and page down, which lets you jump between tabs of a workbook. Note that there's a full comprehensive list of control functions at the link below. These are just the three that I tend to use most often. So jumping back into our Excel workbook, let's use the control arrow shortcut first. I'm going to start on A1, hold control, arrow to the right, arrow down. So as you can see, it's just jumping to the last cell containing data. And we do the same thing, but hold shift as well. Now you can see that it makes the selection as it moves. And again, the control, page down and page up just moves between tabs. So if I hold control and hit page down, jumps to sheet 2, sheet 3, and then page up moves back to the left, back to sheet 1. Finally, we've got our Alt function, which enables key tips. This basically just allows you to access any function in the ribbon using keyboard shortcuts. You don't need to hold down the Alt. You can just press Alt and you'll see the key tips activate. So these little numbers and letters in gray boxes, those are the key tips. So you press Alt to reveal the tab level shortcuts, and then you press whichever one you want to dig deeper into, and it will reveal another set of key tabs. And you continue to drill down until you get to the specific function that you want to jump to. So sometimes it's a combination of multiple key tips to get to the function that you need. Two that I use way more often than any others are Alt-HVV and Alt-HVF. Alt-HVV pastes special as values. Alt-HVF pastes special as formulas. So show you another quick example. Right now our values in column C, these are all formulas. I can select all those, hit Control-C to copy them. And then with D1 selected, instead of going into paste special values, I'm just going to hit Alt. You see the key tips appear. H, I'm dug into the Home tab. V, I'm into the paste sub-options. And then one more V, paste special as values. So, whereas column C contains the formula, column D contains just the value that was the output of that formula. Similar case with Alt-HVF. I can copy the formula in cell C1, and if I want to paste this formula down, and now if these cells didn't contain the formula, let's just delete them. To show this, you can copy C1, and then select C2 through C7, hit Alt-HVF, and it will paste the formulas into that range. So again, those are just a few examples, but they're the shortcuts that I tend to use more than any others. All right, I just want to take a minute or two to talk about Mac equivalents of some of these shortcuts that we just talked about. So one of the more frustrating things in Excel is how the user interface and user experience is so different whether you're using it for Mac or PC. Luckily, because this course focuses on formulas and functions specifically, the syntax, structure, and usage of formulas is going to look basically identical between versions. Where you'll see the biggest differences are, again, the user interface and the shortcuts, but also things like pivot tables and charting and graphing. So let's quickly cover what you would use if you were on a Mac, and you needed to use some of those shortcuts that we just talked about for PC. So instead of F4, you're going to use Command-T to cycle between your cell reference types, and Command-Y to repeat your last user action. Rather than F2, You can use Control U to display your cell ranges that are tied to a given formula, or just double-click the cell in which the formula lives. Now, the control functions for PC or the control shortcuts are really similar. You'll just use Command for a Mac, so Command arrow and Command Shift arrow will jump to the edge or extend a selection to the edge of a contiguous data array. And the Command function or FN, up and down, will jump between workbook tabs on a Mac. The last thing to note here is that, unfortunately, the Alt key tips just don't exist for a Mac, so those tips that let you drill down into very specific components of the ribbon, you just can't do, which is a little bit frustrating. The best resource or reference point that I've found to remember this is at exceljet.net/keyboard-shortcuts. And what I love about this site is that not only does it list more shortcuts than you can ever possibly want to use, but it shows the PC version and the Mac version right there side by side. So there you go, Mac equivalents of some of my favorite PC shortcuts. Let's talk about data validation. It's one of my favorite tools and features of Excel. I use it all the time. It's a really cool way to add a dynamic element to your workbooks. Basically, what data validation does is it allows you to specify what someone can type into a cell. So you can say, only allow whole numbers, only allow numbers between 1 and 10, only allow positive integers or decimals, whatever. One of the most useful forms of data validation, the one that I use most often, is called list, which creates a drop-down menu of options based on a source list that you specify. So you can link to a list in cells that exists in your worksheet, or for the source, you can actually just type in the values that you'd like that cell to take separated by commas. You can also change the input message and the error alert, which can be a lot of fun. So let's jump into Excel and do a very quick example. Just got a blank worksheet here. What I'm going to do is create a list of months. So I'm going to start with Jan, use a little shortcut here called fill series. And so Excel recognized that when I typed Jan, I probably meant January. So when I pulled it down 11 more rows, it guessed that I wanted that to fill in month abbreviations through December. And wouldn't you know, it was right. Excel's actually pretty smart sometimes. So now I've got my list. What I'm going to do in a new cell, let's just say D2, I'm going to go into the Data tab, go into Data Validation here, and just select Data Validation. So in the settings, this is where I set my criteria. So in the Allow drop-down, these are those options that I was referring to. I could say, only allow whole number between 0 and 10, for instance. And then error alert, you can say, all right, I want a pop-up box to appear that says, cut it out. And say, okay. Now, all of a sudden, this D2 has the data validation criteria built in. So if I tried to type 11, I get my error that says cut it out. Same thing if I try to type 3.5, it's not a whole number, so I'll get the same error. So to get rid of a data validation rule, just go back into data validation settings and choose any value. Once you do that, you've kind of reset so you can type anything you want now. I want to show you lists because it's, in my opinion, the most useful. So I'm going to go to Allow, a list, and then my source. This is where I can select data in a range. I'm going to select A2 through A13, which is my source months, and just hit OK. Once I do that, it's created this drop-down where now the only values that you're able to input into this cell are the values that are part of the list that I specified. So as we go on, I'll show you more examples of how this can become a very useful tool when you're building dashboards to kind of change other values in your workbook based on these selections that a user makes. So data validation, really helpful tool. All right, let's wrap up this 101 section by talking about fixed versus volatile functions. Basically, volatile functions are just functions or formulas in Excel that change every time the workbook recalculates. And I don't just mean when a cell that's tied to a given function changes, or an array, a reference that feeds into a formula changes. I mean, anytime you enter data anywhere in any open workbook. So they call them volatile functions for a reason, and that's because they're just constantly changing by nature of what they do. So there aren't a ton of volatile functions in Excel. The more common ones and the ones that we're going to cover specifically include now and today, which are date and time functions, rand, which is a random number generator, and some advanced lookup functions like offset and indirect. So one tip here, you can actually change the calculation option if you choose from automatic, which is the default, to manual. Automatic means that any time you change a cell, a reference that's tied to an existing formula, the output of that formula will change, which is what you want 99.9% of the time. By changing that option to manual, you're essentially saying, I want to freeze all of my formulas in place as if they're values, and I only want you to recalculate when I press the Recalculate or Calculate Now button in the Formulas tab. So, word of warning, this can be useful at times, but it's very easy to forget that you changed the setting to manual. If you do change it, just make sure you change it back. Otherwise, you'll end up with frozen or outdated formulas in your workbook. But there are benefits. If you have a workbook with 10,000 or 100,000 formulas that are constantly recalculating, you might be able to save yourself some headaches by switching to manual mode and only calculating when you choose to. So let's jump into Excel and do a quick example. I'm going to use the rand function in column A. So this is just going to basically create a random number between 0 and 1. And don't worry about the details. I'll cover this in section 4, I believe. So basically what I've done is just create 10 random numbers out to 15 decimal points from A1 through A10. And now if I change any value, like in column C, for instance, you'll note that those numbers in column A continue to change. If I go into the Formulas tab, Calculation Options, switch to Manual. Now, as I continue to make workbook changes, my random number generators are frozen in place. If I do want those to calculate, I just hit the Calculate Now button right here. And as you can see, that's basically having the same effect as any other workbook change, except now I'm in manual mode. So switch back to automatic so you don't forget. But in a nutshell, that's what volatile functions are all about. And with that, let's jump into the next section, talk about logical operators. All right, made it through the end of the Formulas 101 section. If you're feeling really good, really comfortable, go ahead and keep cruising on in the next section. If you do want a little bit of extra practice, you can open up the Excel Homework Exercises file and take a look at the first tab, the Formulas 101 tab. And here I've included some instructions with 4 steps. And through these steps, you're going to practice creating some very simple calculations. You'll practice using shortcuts like F2 and F4, the Trace Precedence tool, and you'll also get some experience replacing errors using Excel's if-error function. So go ahead and give that a shot. Keep in mind that you also have access to the Answers workbook. Both of these are available in Lecture 2 of the course. But as always, reach out if you need anything. Good luck.